Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Odd Lots podcast. I'm Tracy Alloway.
And I'm Joe Weisenthal.
Joe, one of the big topics of discussion, there are a lot of topics of discussion nowadays, but when it comes to the recent takeover of Venezuela, the Trump administration's takeover of Venezuela, I don't know how... Acquisition. I don't know how to describe it.
I don't either.
But the action in Venezuela, one of the themes or things that you saw people talking about was this idea that, well, even if the goal is to get more oil, Venezuela's oil industry is a mess.
It's in shambles. Right?
Yeah. So you hear things about, ships that are rusting in the dock and pumps that don't work and whatever. People talking about really creaky infrastructure and also just a bad environment for doing business.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. And so in the Venezuela specific context, we know that the oil infrastructure has been degraded for years, which is why there is all these numbers about the massive amounts of upfront investment that would be required to get the oil started. But then there's this other phenomenon that's global, which is that there's really not much of a connection per se between the existence of natural resources in the ground and some way to get them out commercially anywhere. This also happens to be the case in Greenland. It happens to be the case in Western Australia, which is a very well-run country, which is that assets in the ground or anywhere mean nothing without the sort of rule of law, refining, processing, shipping infrastructure, et cetera. So all these places of various different degrees, the actual existence of some asset, in Venezuela's case, oil, that's only part of the story.
Absolutely. So this got me thinking, what is it like to actually do some sort of industrial business in a place like Venezuela? And I always wanted to do more on the Venezuelan economy. I think it's pretty interesting and more interesting now. So that is exactly what we're going to do today. We're also going to talk about doing business in another
hotspot.
Hotspot is a good way of putting it, which is Ukraine.
Right. We did a number of episodes immediately after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, talk about the effects on the grain business. But the important thing, which we didn't get into that much, although I think we did a little bit, is the grain business, the wheat export business, it still exists. Right. It was impaired. But then the day-to-day business of running a commercial operation in that intense environment, how that changes and so forth. How does that change under the new competitive strains? And I just want to say one more thing, which is, when you talked about, well, what is the right word now to describe our relationship with Venezuela? I've been thinking about a lot of this too. Because,
do you have a word?
No, I don't, because it's very context dependent, right? Yeah. If you were to listen to the administration, it's like, oh, Maduro was arrested, right? If you believe this was a flagrant violation of international law, you'd say he was kidnapped, et cetera. Right. There's almost no words to describe it. You saw the president talking about, we're already selling Venezuelan oil. So whose oil is this already? It's a very odd situation, to say the least. Definitely.
Okay, so speaking of odd situations, we have the perfect guest to talk about them.
And I just got to say, I got a headline. U.S. seeks immediate talks on acquiring Greenland. Trump says, so at some point we will have another conversation about weird relationships with parts of the world that we didn't think about as much.
Yeah, the Greenland economy episode is
yet to come.
Inevitably going to arrive. Okay, so we're going to be speaking with Jeff Kazin. He is the co-founder of AgrisAcademy and also the other co-founder, Mike Rohlfsen. So Jeff and Mike, thank you so much for coming on Odd Lots. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
So first of all, why don't you give us a sort of nutshell summary of your career history, because this is why we're talking to you. Yeah. Both of you had very long, interesting careers at Cargill, which is, one of the massive agricultural conglomerates, among other things. So talk to us about why we're talking to you, I guess.
Yeah, I guess I'll start out. This is Jeff Kazin. I did a full career in Cargill, 30 years. And, started at the ground up, at, Baton Rouge, Louisiana ports, buying grain to go to export. Was a head of wheat trading, did a lot of wheat trading at some point, spent some time in their mergers acquisition shop around the world, looking at various businesses. Ended up as a CEO of a joint venture between Cargill and Monsanto at the time. Switched over into the vegetable oils, particularly the refined vegetable oils. was the head of trading for what we call the West, so the Western Hemisphere on the refined oil side. And that's actually where my time with Venezuela was connected. Cargill had a very large oils business there, actually a packaged oils business. And I finished up my career in the feed side, a lot of aquaculture, very large salmon feeders around the world, shrimp, all kinds of various aquaculture. And then really the Western side, South Latin America on the feed side, all the way to Argentina. So a typical, highly varied Cargill career.
Similar story with me. Back then, when Jeff and I started, Cargill intentionally threw you around to many different places. So yeah, I had 3 different domestic roles in the early to mid 90s that got your feet wet in different markets in the United States. And I also was involved on the export side out of Houston, similar to what Jeff did. And then about 5 years in, I got tapped on the shoulder to go to Ukraine. There was no real commercial presence for Cargill then.
What year are we talking about? Sorry.
This would have been April of 1995.
Okay.
Yeah, so I was young, I was single, I spoke Russian, I was perhaps tongue-in-cheek.
You ticked all the boxes.
Expendable, and with a blank slate that not really knowing what was going on at the time, and probably rather difficult to find people to come there. Yeah, I had raised my hand already to go, and fortunately they circled back to me and gave me that opportunity, and it was 5 wonderful years there. Taking it basically from a theoretical representative office to I think we had 7 or 8 business units and a couple $100 million invested. So it was a wonderful experience over those 5 years. And I also was with Jeff in the merger and acquisition shop shortly after returning, and went into corporate ventures for a while after that, and left Cargill a little earlier than Jeff did, and went through ag tech and ag tech oriented venture capital. Then about 3 years ago, we kicked this off.
I hope you guys are cool with us turning this into a 5-hour conversation now, because I imagine there's an incredible number of stories, and I already have a billion questions. So we're going to be doing a little bit of that on the fly. Jeff, talk to us about the years you did business with Venezuela, and maybe the difference in what years those were, and then the sort of different conditions from like the beginning to the end as you saw them.
Yeah, so because of the oils business, I was attached to that. And I'd like to say that it was a varied business, and I have a lot of grain experience too. So I ended up kind of the head of overseeing trading for all of it. And probably the biggest statement is, I think when I started, the Boulevard, the currency was like 1 to 800. And and I get my years right. And I think, 3 years later, it was like 1 to 12,000 or something like that. We ended up in that period of super hyperinflation where the economy basically seizes up. And, you watch from the capability, if you don't have a functioning currency and the government makes you sell in local currency, in order to go, you have to have some way to exchange it. And we effectively became dependent on the government to do the exchange, to go out and buy dollarized raw materials. Right now, 80% of global trade is still in dollars, and a lot of the grain trade is. And that probably is the most single telling thing. The currency ceased to function, and that really changed the game on the ground in Venezuela.
I want to get into some of the currency complications in a little bit, but I was surprised that Cargill had any business at all in Venezuela. Can you just tell us what exactly Cargill was doing over there?
Yeah, and keep in mind, I'm currently a former employee, and Cargill does not own the business there anymore. I was reached out to by Cargill. Basically, this is very typical of Cargill. They'll have feed mills. They'll go in. They go out. They'll start with feed mills. They had the long-term salt. Salt was a big play there. Cargill's a large producer globally of salt. A lot of things quietly. I think there was a lot of industrial use salt there. They had the petrochemical business was using salt. I'm not an expert on the petrochemical side. And then there are lots of food processing businesses around the world. In this case, they were natural flour millers, oil refineries, oil bottlers. The rice I had not seen anywhere else in the world. It was actually gone by the time I got there. Pasta plants. So in this case, probably the more unique thing was that not only were we doing primary processing, but we were going all the way to consumer. They actually had I think the number one brand that they had bought over time. I think there was an acquisition from Bunge, predates me, in there also. So they were, this was a very wealthy country and a place where you could do some very good business in, and then repeat that model in multiple countries all over the world. And so, that's how they got there. It was a very natural flow, and they had a very large investment there.
Mike, on Ukraine, 1995 is still the early days of real post-Soviet optimism, right? And people hadn't become jaded yet, and they probably hadn't woken up to sort of all the various pathologies and stuff that would occur in the wake of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, et cetera. Talk a little bit about the calculation and the hopes for Ukraine and the degree to which, over the many years that you've paid attention to this market and worked in it, how they unfolded relative to, say, expectations.
Well, I almost would say you underestimated the optimism at the time. In 95, there was a tremendous amount of optimism. We had a very dynamic team. Quite frankly, even the older folks that we would find to help be a part of what we were doing commercially, even though all they had known is the system. There were folks that were experienced and hardworking and very excited to jump into the sort of things that we were doing in a very differentiated way. So we had rock stars in our group that were 22 and out of school, and we had rock stars that were 60 years old that were probably had some sort of legacy experience in agriculture in the Soviet Union, but was able to translate that to us. And it was an absolutely fantastic experience back then. It was more than just a job. You felt it was transformational. It was, you were changing the way business got done there. There was an insane amount of chaos, but working in a regimented, ethical way got you business by in another route. So we made it work. It was classic Cargill at the time, sort of being sort of pioneering and entrepreneurial. And we made it work and started with the trading side and slowly but surely put assets on the ground and a lot of other more formal things that made it look more and more like a regular geography by the time, the year 2000 rolled around and when I left.
So, Mike, you were on the ground in Ukraine, and Jeff, you were managing the Venezuela business remotely. What was that actually like? Because I imagine, we're talking about a couple decades back now. Communication must have been more difficult than it is even nowadays.
It was very typical. I wouldn't say, we had leading edge AS400s back in the day. And so communications has always been a priority of a trading firm. And so there was a lot of investment in that, right? That was very typical that you would have one. Now, remember, I'm a trading manager, not the overall business manager, but I would have, we would have local merchants in each country, and you've got to connect and coordinate that. Think about if you're buying a multi-grocery boat cargo, you're going to load that cargo in New Orleans with all kinds of different commodities. And it's going to, you're going to leverage that out to get your freight costs down and create competitive advantage. And so you're coordinating all your different trading groups in the region. And then that actually goes out on a global basis. So you're constantly looking for that edge. So I play the coordination role. And then at the local level, you have to have local expertise on the ground, particularly in the cases Venezuela started to become unstable. You need people that understand how to navigate the government, how to navigate the various, channels to get things and continue to get things done. And that takes local know-how. So that was kind of that big picture role that I would be filling in, of course, the risk management side. And then you have that very local execution side to make things happen. And you got to have both.
Yeah, and the same proxy existed for us, at least in our external communication and how we linked up. So my usual routes of communication went through our Geneva office, and then outward throughout the rest of Cargill. So the external communication was world class. We had satellite phones through which we ran our modems and that kind of thing early on, at least. Internal, a whole different story. I could probably waste 45 minutes explaining just simple sending a fax type story and things like that in 1995 and 1996. But before things got a little bit better integrated. But yeah, it was a dichotomy between internal and external, but manageable nonetheless.
One of my first journalism jobs was literally monitoring the fax machine and making sure if a fax came in that the newsroom would be aware of it. Thrilling times.
We could easily do an hour on internal communications and the sort of like pre-email, pre-Slack, pre-IB. Well, the pre-IB era is very long ago, but pre-digital document management in general and how that must have been. And maybe we'll have you back just to talk one day about that. Jeff, I remember I had it's interesting enough, I forgot about this, but when my first year of college, I had a roommate who I think had done some mission work for his church in Venezuela. And he was there when by the time he was roommates, he was talking about, this guy, Hugo Chavez, it looks like he's going to win. This is going to be bad news, et cetera. And so should have taken that more seriously and paid more attention. What was, though, the point? A lot of people were concerned about Chavez, obviously. What was the point, though, in which you sort of saw like, okay, this is turning down? And what was it? And what was the process by which like, we're starting to get serious inflation. We're starting to have a more difficult time doing business or importing dollar-denominated machinery. When did that sort of sink in for the business?
Yeah, so I arrived, we were already to Maduro. So we were already, so Chavez, the time there had already passed. And, it's the frog in the boiling pot, right? Mm-hmm. It starts small and then it starts to, and then you get all these unintended consequences. And you're trying to, and then, there's a socialist regime, you're trying to plug holes, right? And all these things that start to go on. And plus, you also have a government that is healthily paranoid about being overthrown, right? There's a power aspect that's going on, all of this at the same time. I think it really, really took a plunge. I mean, it wasn't good at Chavez, but when the currency and, as you said, the oil industry starts to deteriorate, so that spigot of dollars is drying off. It takes ever more dollars to pay off everybody in the system, right? It's a constant payoff system. And then you don't have enough money, so you just run the printing press, right? I remember this. There was a point, it happened so fast. A couple of stories. One is the BTU of a paper boulevard. The BTU value is worth more than it could buy. You could burn it.
So you literally burn them for fuel.
You could burn it for fuel.
That's crazy.
And there was a time where they were having the boulevards printed, but they didn't pay their printing bill, and they were flying it in. The printing was being done in dollars outside the country. They didn't have enough money to buy the boulevards to fly them in. So you started running out of currency on the ground. Like, even if you wanted to work on it, there's all kinds of these kind of stories, but it was right in that probably 2 years into Maduro space when the currency stopped functioning. That was really when we knew we were in trouble.
Just to go back to something you said, so an American company working in any foreign country has to abide by American laws, particularly related to things like bribery and corruption. And maybe for both of you, and I imagine, that this is a very prominent issue in both these countries, maybe more in Venezuela than Ukraine, et cetera, but we know that there's significant corruption in Ukraine, et cetera. Can you talk a little bit about essentially how you function in these environments where probably lots of people are getting paid off literally or in the bribery sense, and how you have to navigate that from the perspective of a multinational?
I'll start.
Sure.
And going back again within the perspective of the mid-90s, there were two impediments, and I use the word impediment, not that it impeded us, but it did create a headwind for, shall we say, the ease of doing business and the scale of doing business.
Yeah.
So the two parts that created impediments for us is there still was a fair amount of governmental influence in the grain business in 1995, and it really was from a county perspective and a state, or what they refer to as oblast perspective, all the way up to the central government. So there were plenty of ways to keep those people happy and quietly buy grain at scale that would also go through a state-owned railroad system and a state-owned port system. So most of the infrastructure, and there were gatekeepers at various stages that could easily be catalyzed, shall we say, to get grain out the door at very reasonable numbers and trade at large scale. And I could name names, but there's plenty of some of the global traders that don't have to apply to the U.S. rules-based system. So what we basically did it old school. We went straight to the farms in smaller quantities, in reasonable amounts with people we could trust, and just gutted it out through atypical ways of getting the grain out of the country, which ironically is some of the infrastructure that we built on the Danube River system. That it's very lumpy. It's transshipment through cranes and vacuation systems and things like that, as opposed to a big, high scale elevator. Those are some of the things today that are getting grain out of the country because some of the main elevators have been destroyed or damaged in some way. So that was our biggest problem. You could get around it, and quite frankly, it was more rewarding doing it that way because we saw our impact on the ag sector. But that was sort of the big picture reality at the time when I first got there.
I think in my case, it is comforting as operating is to know you don't have to pay those type of bribes or facilitated payments. The company did a very good job of instilling that. Everybody who joined trained on it yearly and quite frankly backed it up, right? If you didn't make your numbers because you would have had to pay a bribe to get there, it didn't hurt you career-wise. They knew you talk about it, you tell them I'm not going to do this, and it happened. And we had these stories that happened. But so on that side, it made it very clear for your employees to know how to operate. The other thing I want you to think about in the global food space, right, is if you're a Nestle or a Frito-Lay or one of that, and you're buying raw materials, so you have a plant in Venezuela. Okay. You want to make sure that you have food safe product, U.S. grade, and the standards, right? Food safety. You want to it actually draws business to you, right?
Right. And the brand value of American food.
Right. And that you're going to act honestly, and they don't have to pay a bribe to get a truck, to the plant on that day, right? The things like that, the way you can do business. So at that time, let's call them Western companies. They're now today more modern companies. They like to go to some of these early markets together. And because they knew that they had a supplier that, if you were making malt barley for the brewery and it's a, South African brewery, they knew that you were actually going to, make a contract and stick to the contract no matter what. If we had to work it out, there was crop failure, you would, hold your word was your bond. And I'm going to tip a hat off to my former employer. They were very good about how that operated. And I worked with them in places basically in all the corners of the world, and everything from, fish meal to lysine to wheat. That brand helps out in these environments because the customers can count on you. And in food, super important, right? Because if you screw that up, you can kill somebody and or tarnish the customer's brand, right? If something gets through this, that's the same way it is in the U.S. actually, but not with maybe the same criticality when you're working in a remote location around the world.
So this actually leads into something I'm really curious about, which is obviously Cargill is a private company operating at that time under a socialist regime under Maduro. What was the relationship like just between a private commercial enterprise and a socialist government, especially for something as critical as food, right? I imagine the government cared about the food supply.
We had to follow both sets of laws, right? You have to follow the local law too, right? So if they say you must transact in bolivars, you have to transact in bolivars. Now, we didn't have Tether or Bitcoin at this point, right? So the world's changing in an interesting way. You have to follow that. I mean, you don't want to, poke the bear, right? And then you have to have people that become experts in how whatever government you're working with runs. And we do. And that's how but this was a very common, still is common to operate in some of these places where, places that have cocoa, right? Some of the African countries there, Zimbabwe, right? South Africa. You still have this situation. You have to there is a competitive advantage in becoming experts at working in difficult places.
Were you ever pressured though, for instance, to lower grocery prices?
Oh, absolutely, all the time, right? And there were laws on theoretically how much you could make and how the counting was done on that. And, if we had a global rice shortage, it was not the fact that we had a global rice shortage and prices rising. It was Cargill that was doing it too, to the people. You had to have a scapegoat effectively. And, at some point you just know that you can't import at price X and sell it for X minus, a bunch, and you'll just bleed out. And quite frankly, at some point, and several geographies, we get a situation where corporation says, we will put no more dollars in the country. And we were there. And I can still remember that. So if we wanted to import something, we had to get dollars either from the government or figure out how to export something that created dollars. So that's where you really start to struggle, because you basically are relying on the government to exchange bolivars for dollars. And that's where we tried all kinds of things to try to export. I mean, there was salt there. We tried pallets. But every time you tried to do something, somebody in the economy was like grabbing that. Oh, no, if you really want to move that, to the port, that's going to require some facilitation payment or something like that. It just, and the team down there was desperately trying it, because the other thing we needed beyond just raw materials, we needed spare parts. And this maybe lies to your question about what's the situation there. If you need to buy some electrical equipment from Siemens, they're not going to want bolivars. They want euros or dollars. So we were having to try to figure out how to generate enough dollars just to get spare parts. And, I'm not sure how, and I can only speak for my situation, is now the team is really focused, instead of kind of on their day-to-day job of running logistics and parts, and getting things in, their jobs switched to how do we originate dollars. So you have, a couple of people that are just expert in government and maybe like camp out at government offices for long periods of time trying to figure out, winding through the red tape. And then you have people trying to figure out, hey, can we, put 1 kilo bag or 1 metric ton bags together of salt that's sitting in this pile and get them out of the country and sell them to generate dollars. So now you have a dollar generation team, and that can play out all over. Argentina before Malay, I don't know what the situation is now, was like that also. When you have hyperinflation, you get into the situation where you have to have a team that's just hunting dollars.
I wasn't expecting the conversation to go in this, but for either one of you, and Jeff, you mentioned I wasn't expecting to talk about Tether in this episode, but in today, 2026, when you think about sort of these currency bottlenecks that exist, do cryptocurrencies, or whether it's stable coins or something truly decentralized like Bitcoin, are people seriously either implementing or thinking about how some of these new financial technologies can solve pain points within the global ag trade?
Mike, this is your specialty.
Yeah, well, again, I can't speak to the specificity, maybe country by country, but certainly if you look maybe in the big picture, the average producer somewhere in the world that has a currency issue where it impedes them and maybe the quality of their bank, their access to capital, their access to foreign currency to upgrade whatever it is, absolutely the Tethers of the world and things like that are going to fundamentally change the access to that sort of thing. Where when you compare it to the way it was before, for sure. And I will maybe add a little half answer to what you threw out there too. There's a lot of great stories for folks looking for something to entertain themselves around Bitcoin, especially the early Bitcoin mining that was going on in Venezuela, for people that were concerned about where the country was going, where they would, tap into a small hydro plant at maybe a family's place out in the woods somewhere and mine Bitcoin, put it on a wallet and had it as their escape valve in case they needed it. And sure enough, there was a night where they traipsed through the jungle and went to another country and had it on their wallet and started another life. So yeah, there's some very interesting early pioneering Bitcoin stories around what the Bolivar forced folks to do early on.
talk to us about people actually leaving Venezuela, because this is also something that you hear a lot about, which is, if you were a Venezuelan with some amount of means in the past, you were very incentivized to leave, especially if you're working in certain businesses that the government was targeting. Did you experience that at Cargill as well, this sort of brain drain?
It happened all the time. First, I want to set the scene, right? We have at the time we had an office in Caracas, very nice, right? We had a lot of employees there, not just because we had a brand business, right? We had people that were, label designers. And I mean, it was the full on, think of it, I don't know, more of maybe the Procter & Gamble, the retail side of things. So big office, nice. We had, satellite communications there. There was no Starlink yet. And so the office was a nice place, right? And people actually, are like, oh yeah, I was there on Saturday. And I'm like, and the problem is when you left that office, you zipped to your gated community, more likely an apartment complex. You just had to go from secured compound to secured compound. And then it became, you didn't know if you were having water that week or hot water. You might not have electricity for several days. You might not have access. There might not be anything to buy in a grocery store. Now our employees were getting some food from us because we made some basics, right? Every week we would make sure that we got something transferred from the plants and put this stuff together. So the life, style that people lived was not easy, even for those that theoretically had, were well educated, had good jobs. And eventually, even our business, of course, the business is slowing down, and they leave. And then, of course, in our case, we had a plant that got nationalized at gunpoint. Well, if you're, a highly skilled manager operator, you don't want to stick around and start to have to do your job at gunpoint, right? Because they don't have any expertise in how to run the plant. So the big wave, somebody said several million Venezuelans were the most educated, the most skilled, and it compounded itself, right? Because, now nobody knows how to run the electric generation station, right? That nobody knows, obviously the petrochemical industry, right? You can go get reemployed around the world. If you're a petro engineer, no problem. And so those people went all over the place. And the beauty of working for a multinational is we picked up as many as we could. And that is, in that conversation to bring, you have an employee they call, they're very nationalistic. They know they're doing important work. They've had enough. And you get that call and they go, it's kind of sheepish. They're like, they feel like they're abandoning you. And, we go and find them. And my story was, one of my last employees just says, I'm going to Mexico City. I think his wife was working for Sony at the time and had some type of employment. And I said, well, what are you going to do? And he goes, I don't know, but I'm not going to be here anymore. I mailed my big screen TV and a couple things DHL, and I'm going to take my guitars on the plane and I'm done. And I said, well, I know what you're going to do. You're going to go to this address and you're going to work for me in Mexico. And that played out hundreds of times inside my employer. You'd go to a meeting in Mexico City. I still remember a management meeting. They run a very large crush refine facility north of Mexico City. And half the people in the room are Venezuelans, talented, smart, educated. And that played out. I know, from my social media, that happened in lots of Western companies. They were my experience working with Venezuelans it was fantastic. They had a good education system, smart, business savvy, and we gladly reemployed them around the world.
Sticking with Venezuela for a moment, and we've heard all the numbers about the oil industry and the amount of upfront capital it would take to sort of profitably begin shipping oil at scale or selling oil at scale. What is your understanding right now of the equivalent within the realms that you're working in, grains? Is there the same sort of view that all the infrastructure that was being used during the days when it was working profitably would need a significant amount of capital for an entity like Cargill or the sort of family of global food companies to want to re-enter that business?
Look, I am not a Venezuelan expert. Our business is actually in education and risk management around supply chains, and we do a lot of work with U.S. growers. So this was a bit of an accidental experience to from what happened to bring me here today. We do know we were struggling to keep the plants maintained. And I'm sure there's a lot of work that has to be done. I think the number one thing you have to have is security, right? You have to be able. You're going to need some promises. There's a lot of companies that lost a lot of money in Venezuela, right? With the assets they had. Because the second you walk away from an asset there, try to even say mothball it, everything gets stolen. Okay. You don't expect you walk into a plant that you shut down 5 years ago that there'll be anything there. You have to defend it at all times. Otherwise, if somebody's going to go in there and sell the parts in the black market and scrap the rest, because scrap iron trades in dollars, and so you can't expect that unless whatever it is running, you can't expect much. And I know that they were started as strange things that happened as the domestic situation got worse. They actually had to increase imports of finished goods because you couldn't finish them in the country anymore. But there was still demand, and you had remittances, right? Same with like Mexico, right? So there is some dollars floating even into people that stayed. I know, we had some employees that talk about sending money to their families in Venezuela, and easier to do now probably, but that was, the Miami banking connection and some things like that. So I suspect that there's, a tremendous amount of work, but I'm not an expert on the current situation. I think it can be done in the basic staples. Those plants are not that hard. Flour mills, oil refineries. Yeah, there's no doubt if the world put their mind to it. And I just saw we sold $300 million worth of oil here this morning. They went apparently to buy the currency. Remember we talked about currency stabilization. Yeah. Apparently they must have used a lot of that to buy bolivars and create a more stable exchange so you can get the economy floating. So, hats off to the current administration for somebody's obviously paying attention. But yeah, it's going to take security. It's going to take some promises, stability, because, you're talking about putting hundreds of millions of dollars on the ground into a place where effectively those type of investments were lost. And I don't think that's going to be an easy sell to the multinational world.
What was it like just moving stuff within Venezuela? Because you describe how an empty plant would be gutted fairly quickly. I imagine if people saw an opportunity, a truckload of something that could be valuable on the road, they probably seized on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't matter. Venezuela was, we had security experts that worked for us that understood what they had to do on the ground to get shipments, like say from the port to the plant, or from the plant to a grocery store, right, or something like that, or some kind of distribution. It's very difficult. My more recent, you think this doesn't go on in Mexico, we were losing a lot of trucks. Sometimes we'd get the trucks back. Sometimes we lost the cargo and the trucks. That still goes on right today. And you sit there and try to understand what is the cost of doing business, right? And you will lose some along the way. And sometimes you hire local companies that are more able to navigate how to get things moved from point A to point B. And you effectively have to work from inside your compound. You also have to secure from theft, right, at the compound, right? It's just all these drags on the economy when you get into these situations, right? It's just dragging the entire country down. In hyperinflation, I think if you studied it, Mike and I both have some economics degrees. There's all these dragging taxes on people. Your employee gets paid today, and they just, as soon as they get paid, they run out and spend it. Like they're done for the rest of the day, right? The shoe leather tax, right? And now everything has to be secured with, multi fences and barbed wire and constant guards and trucks and all that stuff. And if you can remove that burden from the economy, it's just a huge, boost to the economy. And Mike and I are, watching things in Argentina. I love going there. It's a beautiful place and highly recommend. But let's see how that goes, because it feels like the country is starting to lose some of those shackles.
Tracy, I just have a warning to you, by the way.
To me
Yeah.
specifically? Okay.
Yeah, you're not going to like it. I've been watching the show Landman on
yes.
CBS.
Yeah.
And so when we do commodity episodes, I'm going to start referencing a lot of things that I observe. But one of the themes was one of the plot lines very early on is the phenomenon of both trucks that disappear because the cartels steal them and then magically reappear a month later. And it's not worth asking any questions because then you have to get the FBI involved and then, et cetera. So the idea, what Jeff was saying about the truck suddenly coming back is something that I'm familiar with because I'm a viewer of TV.
Stood up by the television. Yeah. I'm going to steel myself for all the Landman.
Yeah, you're going to get a lot, especially when we do oil episodes.
Yeah.
Mike, talk to us. Give us a sort of your sense of Ukraine now and versus before the war. And obviously there's still wheat flowing out, but we've talked about the impairment, et cetera. What is the sort of scale of the impairment and the damage, et cetera, and what sort of levels are coming out of Ukraine? And sort of give us your sense of where things are these days versus at the end of 2021.
Sure. And again, I'm going to say something fairly similar to what Jeff is. I'm not as on the ground there, though I'm very close with a lot of friends that are still farming at scale and trying to make whatever it is they're doing work. I would sort of start off with a theme I'm sure you've heard that, they're incredibly resilient people. They've been through similar things like this before, and perhaps not this generation, but certainly in the not too distant past, whether it be the Holodomor and post-Soviet situation and some of the starvation that came out of that, and then the World Wars I and II, and so it isn't like it's that distant in their past, and they're figuring it out in a relatively simplified way, and I think that the two biggest changes as it pertains to the grain side is a simplification. So instead of some of the more complex to grow or expensive to grow crops like sunflowers and corn, they're pivoting more back to the basics of wheat and barley and things like that just, when in doubt, put that out there and see if we can get at it in the spring. The human capital piece is an enormous problem right now. They, just to find people that can be part of your work teams, whether it be driving the trucks or driving the combines and tractors or overseeing the grain elevator operations is really, really hard. And then, as I alluded to earlier, some of the main horsepower export points have either been damaged or eliminated entirely or disrupted in terms of them being kind of gray as to where they're located relative to this current fighting front, sort of where it's located. But they're limping along, and I've been kind of surprised, to be honest with you, the total amount of grain that's been grown. It's just the mix has changed, the directions through which they're exported are changed, and certainly that ultimately changes the price that comes back to the producer there. So I'm sure they're not doing particularly well, but they're to their credit, they're still giving it a hard swing.
Just real quickly, so a thing I would like to learn today, what is it about wheat that makes it a sort of simpler crop to process and export than corn? Well,
the seed is materially less expensive. The fertility required is materially less expensive, per acre in their world per hectare. The other thing that's just circumstantially supportive in that part of the world is the organic matter and the richness of the soil there is incredible. So you can kind of get away with it with lesser intensive agronomic crops like wheat to still eke out a pretty darn good crop. So that's the circumstance there. It's also fairly easy to recycle your wheat and you utilize it as seed. Where that's not as straightforward with other crops.
I have one last question, and this is to both of you, but what would be your major piece of advice or message to a multinational company that's considering either, maybe they're looking at Venezuela and going, there's an opportunity there, I want in, or maybe they're thinking about post-war Ukraine and expansion there. What would you tell those companies?
Well, I mean, you have to have some expertise if you're going to go into these places. So if you don't have it with you, you need to find it and find people you trust. security is going to be your number one part of it. Start with a small business, right, to learn how things actually work. We used to start with feed mills. You can put up a Kazin mill, relatively small portable feed mills, and start to learn how things actually work on the ground. We have hundreds of stories where we bought businesses, thought we knew what was going on, even after we'd been there, only to find out on first day that, you're supposed to pay a bribe to the meat inspector or something like that. So my advice is find a small business that you can run there with a reasonable investment and treat that as a learning curve, or paying tuition before you jump in and make those big hard capital asset investments.
Yeah, and Ukraine has slightly different context. I think the blueprint is there. Is if you look at the I would kind of describe the glory days of the grain business in the late 90s, when the infrastructure really got built back up in a way that served the global markets with a lot of value-added processing, tremendous amount of investment that went through the aughts, probably 05, 06, 08, right around there. So the blueprint is there. I just think it's going to take, resilient people, patience, attempting to maintain your teams there within the reality of the things that are going to be personal decisions for them, for their safety, for their family, for whatever. You're just going to have to go with that flow for the foreseeable future and see how this all plays out.
All right, Mike and Jeff, thank you so much for coming on Odd Lots. That was fascinating. We could go on for another hour or two or three and listen to all your stories of doing business in these places, but we're going to have to leave it there. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having us on.
Thank you.
Joe, that was super interesting.
Super interesting.
Both from an agricultural perspective and then obviously the Venezuelan and Ukrainian perspective. One thing that stood out to me was this idea of large companies, multinationals coming together when they enter a new market like that, because it becomes easier to operate, I guess, at the legal and cultural level that they're used to. That was really interesting.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that at all, right? So it's like global multinationals, even setting aside law, they have certain norms you just sort of expect. And so someone from Nestle talks to someone from, I don't know, whatever, and they're like, oh, we'll have a shipment here at this time. And they can more or less expect that entity will do that.
Right.
And without too much translation or whatever. And so the idea that is really important is something I hadn't thought of. Also on this, and it's something I've thought about even working at a large multinational ourselves, is this way that like large companies are sort of, we call them multinationals, but they're also like nations unto themselves in this sense. Like think about the fact that when you move from New York to Abu Dhabi to Hong Kong and back to New York, that there is a team that facilitates all of these processes of like visas and stuff like that and so forth. And I thought about that when he described the phenomenon of the workers being more comfortable in the office than back home, that like the corporate office in this environment is like this like pocket of sort of, I guess you would say, developed world ease and comfort, right? And that the moment you leave that office, you are out of that. Then you suddenly have to worry about electricity. Then you sort of have to worry about maybe running water and security, and how big companies sort of create these security and legal environments within themselves that are these like cross-border pockets, but that will be the same from one office to another, regardless of what country they're operating in. Yeah,
absolutely. The other thing that I was thinking about was the currency question when it comes to Venezuela. I mean, you would assume with maybe this new relationship with the U.S., access to dollars maybe will get a little bit easier. But it was fascinating to hear from Jeff just how creative they got when it came to securing dollars. So for instance, trying to export wooden pallets in exchange for U.S. currency and things like that. Basically bartering, right?
Yeah, it does sound like it basically comes down to bartering, or like, here are some sacks of salt that can be used. And then you have this issue, which is that you can have all of the talent in the country, although much of it's left in many of these cases, but you have all this talent and you have all this raw commodities, but you need a part. And you need it from some advanced specialty maker of an industrial part for a refinery or whatever.
Yeah.
And that's sold by a European multinational, and you need hard currency for that. And so there is no getting around this fact that, like, true self-sufficiency is very rare. It almost doesn't exist anywhere in the world so long as any one component. And of course, we know this is what China is trying to solve for. They want to have every aspect of the entire supply chain in-house such that there is no possibility of them not being able to access one part and grinding a whole industry to a halt.
Yeah. All right. We could go on. But
Yeah.
Shall we leave it there?
Let's leave it there.
This has been another episode of the Odd Lots podcast. I'm Tracy Alloway. You can follow me at Tracy Alloway.
And I'm Joe Weisenthal. You can follow me at The Stalwart. Follow our guests Jeff and Mike and their work at AgrisAcademy at AgrisAcademy. Follow our producers Carmen Rodriguez at Carmen Armin, Dashiell Bennett at Dashbot, and Cale Brooks at Cale Brooks. And for more Odd Lots content, go to Bloomberg.com/oddlots. We have a daily newsletter and all of our episodes. And you can chat about all of these topics 24/7 in our Discord, discord.gg/oddlots.
And if you enjoy Odd Lots, if you like it when we talk about what it was really like to do business in places like Venezuela and Ukraine, then please leave us a positive review on your favorite podcast platform. And remember, if you are a Bloomberg subscriber, you can listen to all of our episodes absolutely ad-free. All you need to do is find the Bloomberg channel on Apple Podcasts and follow the instructions there. Thanks for listening.